Welcome to the components of a data frame. There are three distinct components that you must be aware of: the columns, index, and data. So if you take a look down here at this styled data frame, you'll see that the columns are in green above, the index is in red to the left, and the data is just everything else over here in this bluish purple color. So you might not think these look like distinct objects, but it's important to think of the columns and the index as these distinct objects that label values. So let me tell you what that means. If you take a look at, say, this start time column, this start time column labels each one of these values that come below it. Just like this trip duration column labels all of these values over here. So it's like a reference that will point to all of the values below it. So if you take a look at the index, you might think of it as just not really even attached to the data frame, but it is actually very important. It has the same role as the columns, but it does so for the rows. So this label 0 over here labels all of the row values of the first row. Just like this integer 3 over here labels all of the values in this row. So by default, pandas will use an index that begins at integer 0 and continue from there. But as we'll see later on, the index can be strings as well. So it's not just stuck with integers, and it looks quite benign over here when it's integers and meaningless, but it does actually have a very important role and very important meaning. It's basically the same as the columns, but for the rows. Now, one other piece of information is that you can think of the data frame as like a coordinate plane where you have an X and Y axis. So Pandas also has this idea of an axis. There are two directions, and the columns are given axis number 1, the integer 1, and index as axis 0. So these will come up a little later. You don't have to really worry about that now, just so that you are aware of it when we do reach these axis numbers further on in the course. Okay, so let's take a look at the bikes data frame in an actual notebook, not just styled like that. So the columns will be bold and on top of this line over here, so they'll be very distinct. And just as we talked about earlier, each one of these columns is a label for all the values that follow below it. And then over here you can see the index, and again it looks like maybe just quite meaningless, but it is an important part. It just happens to be that they are integers. So this integers 2 labels this entire row right here. Okay, so those are the three distinct components of a data frame: the columns, the index, and then everything else is called the data, or otherwise known as the values.